Okay, so as part of our seminar on higher order thinking in the classroom, we're going to examine one of the strategies, which is David Hyerle's thinking maps. David Hyerle was an American educationalist who designed a series of thinking maps in an attempt to visually represent a series of cognitive processes. Because if we think about the traditional way in which we ask students to record their thought processes on paper, we tend to do so in quite a narrow number of ways, whether it be continuous prose, answers to written questions, a table, a spider diagram, or some form of annotation, or even lists. But Hyerle believed that this way of representing thought processes was too narrow, and it didn't actually coach and train students in the thought process itself. He designed a series of 8 maps that in an attempt to accurately represent the thought process that students were being coached in and that they were actually developing and completing the task. Now, before we actually have a look at those, there's a couple of introductory guidelines that we really need to just think about. The first one is that whenever introducing a thinking map, particularly for the first time, it should be done in a non-subject specific context. The reason for this is it helps with the transferability of the thinking map and therefore of the thought process. If I was to introduce a particular thinking map in a historical context immediately, then students would interpret that as, well, this is a history task or this is a history process, when actually it's not. It's a broader thinking process that can be transferred into other subject areas. So when we introduce thinking maps, we need to do so in a non-subject specific context. The second point is that we should explain the thought process that the thinking map is attempting to represent, and not take for granted that students will automatically see the link between the visual representation and the thought process itself. The third point asks us to be quite explicit and detailed in some cases on how the map is drawn. Things like connecting lines or the direction of arrows can sometimes be quite important in coaching students in the thinking process. The fourth point suggests that we should ask students to draw the thinking maps themselves on blank paper and avoid providing them with templates. That is because the drawing of the map is part of the developmental process, and also by providing a template, we're in some ways limiting the range of students' responses. So if I've got a bubble map with asking for 5 descriptive qualities, that is limiting students to 5 qualities when some students might produce 10 qualities. So that providing a template in that example would actually limit the student's response, and that's not what it's designed to do. The fifth point here is crucial. A thinking map can be used in 2 different ways. It can either be the designed learning outcome itself, by adding detail and providing examples in the thinking map, by having pictures to support it. It can actually be the representation or the demonstration of students learning in its own right. Or it can be a developmental task leading to the production of something else, whether that be, it might actually form the basis of a writing frame before an essay is produced, or a presentation is delivered. So sometimes it can be the outcome itself, and sometimes it can be a developmental stage in the production of something else. Whichever it is, that needs to be made clear from the outset. And the final guidance point is that students should be encouraged to produce them in pencil or using post-it notes, so that mistakes can be made, things can be moved, because that again is part of the developmental feedback. It's part of the developmental process, rather. So let's have a look at 1 or 2 of these thinking maps in very brief detail. The first is a very simple map for a very simple thought process, that of describing qualities. And the bubble map is sometimes used instead of a spider diagram. But the bubble map is specific, and it's asking for qualities of the central theme. So here it's an example of a gymnast, and we can see 5 descriptive qualities that a gymnast would have. Now that is often used as a starting point of thinking maps because it dovetails and it feeds nicely into the double bubble map, where students compare and contrast two factors or entities. And in the center we'll have the common features, and on the wings of the map we have features that just apply to one of those entities. So here we have an example of humans and plants. Okay. The next one is the flow map, which is again a simple thought process of sequencing and putting events or things into some kind of sequence. These two small boxes underneath can add detail. So here we have the example of making a cup of tea. The multi-flow map is particularly popular with historians, humanities teachers, geographers, and it essentially is about illustrating cause and effect of a central event. So the event goes in the middle, causes on the left-hand side of the map, and effects on the right-hand side of the map. So here's our non-subject specific example of getting good GCSE results. We then have a couple of maps that are particularly popular with science specialists. So we have tree maps for classifications, and we have brace maps that are an analytical tool. So you break a whole into various parts. Easy example being fractions. One that can be quite fun is asking students to think of analogies. And by doing so, they're demonstrating their understanding of a relationship, essentially. So here we have an example of weakness, and some fun examples there. The final map is the circle map, and this can be used instead of a brainstorm or spider diagram. And students are asked to define an entity and then also asked to think about the contexts within which they have defined it. So here we have examples of uniform, and then students have had to color code the context within which they have attempted to define the uniform. So the task that we're looking to do in the CPD session itself is you're going to pick one of the thinking maps from the booklet and from the presentation and complete it for a topic you're currently teaching or about to teach through the course of this term. And whilst you're doing so, I'm going to ask you to reflect on two things. How does this ensure students are thinking at a higher level? And is there a way you could extend students thinking further this map by asking them to do something additional to that map? Okay.